Hi, I'm Steve Sink, also known as Pagan Zero. Today we're going to talk about how to do keyframe animation in Mandelbulber, also known as MDBB. Let me just start from scratch here. Let's say we're going to open up Mandelbulber from scratch. There we go. We're going to make it a large size. I am playing with 4K resolution here, so some of my windows and text are a little off. First thing we're going to do is get all of the windows we're going to use. We have the navigation pane here in the upper right hand corner. Let's go to view here, and first thing we're going to do is make sure show animation dock is clicked. We're going to turn off show measurement dock and any other of these that are there. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to turn on show toolbar, something that I don't ever use, but we're going to use it for purposes of this demonstration. Okay, first thing we want to do is we want to pull up our animation window like this so that we can see everything. That's going to shrink our display here, which is fine. We don't need to use that much. We are going to do keyframe animation. Now, what is keyframe animation? Animation, as most of you know, is just simply showing a bunch of images one after another. These images are called frames, and we're going to show several frames per second. And the faster we show the frames per second, the smoother the motion in the image will be. Standard animation frames per second is about 30, or 29 and a fraction, but we'll for our purposes we're going to call it 30. So first thing we're going to do is look at this animation pane here. I won't go through each button now. We're going to go through each button as we use them. But what I will show, we're going to set our project up to start with. First thing we're going to do is make sure we'll use these defaults. How many frames per keyframe? We'll talk about that in a second. Frames per second should be 30 by default. Collision distance, we're going to leave alone right now. Path for images, that's what we're going to change. We're going to, first off, just start a project. Let's go over here, file, and just save settings, save it in a folder somewhere. I'm gonna go to my D drive. Sorry, let's go to my D drive, fractals. And I've created a folder here I've called demo, and that's where I'm going to save this. We'll call this MDBB demo. Okay, now path for the images, we're going to create some images, and when we do, we're going to need to put them someplace. Let's go select folder. And the default is going to be in your user, your name, Mandelbulber animation folder. But we're going to change that. I'm going to go back to this Fractal demo folder I made. And I've already made several test folders in here. I'm going to make a new one. We'll call this test 4. And that's where I'm going to store my images. Go ahead and click select folder. Okay, path for images is now in that demo test 4 folder. The type of images I want to save, I'm going to use JPEGs. And before I get going, I'm going to do one setting. Actually, I'm going to do a couple settings, and we'll come back to that here in just a second. In fact, let's do those now. Let's go ahead and change our settings. Go up to your File, Program Preferences, and I'm going to have to enlarge this because my defaults aren't large enough. First off, in image, it'll be right, let's see, JPEG quality I've turned up to 100%. And the reason I'm doing that is because later on when I post-process these images, I'm going to turn them, I'm going to compress them with some kind of compression algorithm, a codec, and I want to leave these at a maximum quality, but I am going to use JPEGs for my animations. over here on the OpenCL GPU tab. Now this is the most important for our purposes. What we're using here in Mandelbulber is OpenCL, and it's using your graphics card to render animations rather than using the computer chip, your CPU, your central processing unit. We're going to use the graphics processing unit, is GPU. So over here on OpenCL GPU, I want OpenCL enabled. It'll show NVIDIA CUDA is the platform I'm using, and I'm going to go to my device. If I have more than one video card, I'm going to select one of them. I happen to have two installed, a 1080 Ti and a 980. I select the 1080. I'm going to leave precision as single. My options are single and double, not an option with GTX cards. Memory limit, I believe the default parameter is going to be 512. We're going to leave that alone at 400 right now. That's good. Only two things I wanted to save, only two things I wanted to check were images here, to make sure that was 100%, and then OpenCL to make sure that I have that one selected, 400. Okay. Now, real quick, up here in the right-hand corner, up in my navigation pane, there is a new drop-down button called OpenCL mode. I want to make sure that that is selected to full. If it's not to full, I'm going to be in trouble. No OpenCL if I want to use the CPU to render fractals, which I might want to do because there's some capabilities that haven't been ported over to the GPU side yet. But fast, limited, and full are my options. I'm going to make sure that's selected on full. Right below that, I have auto refresh, which will, every time I make a change, it'll refresh, but I'm not a big fan of that. I usually leave that off. I'll refresh when I want to refresh. Okay, we're all ready to go. Back at our keyframe animation, we have two options on the animation. We have flight animation and we have keyframe animation. Flight animation, not going to mess with, never touching it ever. I actually absolutely despise it. I don't like the herky-jerky motion it makes. Keyframe animation is what we're going to use. What is keyframe animation? Simplest put, keyframe animation is simply taking a picture and then another picture and maybe another picture and asking the computer to draw the differences between this picture and this picture. These pictures are called frames. We have 30 frames per second. And a keyframe is basically like a milepost along the way. It's a snapshot, excuse me. A snapshot is how I like to refer to them. We're going to take a snapshot. First off, let's pick a formula. Up here, I deliberately had my toolbar open so that we could pick a formula. We're going to pick the easiest, most basic shape, the Mandelbulb. I double-clicked that up here on the taskbar, and then that loaded the parameters into Mandelbulber. If I hit render, boom, we have an image. This is your basic Mandelbulb. Not a lot I can do with this right now. Let me check image, and the default size is going to be 800 by 600, and that's fine. We're going to make sure, I'm not going to make any changes to any settings at the moment. I'm just going to leave this as the default. What I am going to do is I'm going to go on over here to my keyframe animation menu, and I'm going to hit the button add keyframe, and then voila, boom, we have our first keyframe. This keyframe is tracking, we're going to ignore this audio pane right here, animation by sound. We're going to completely ignore that, just ignore it altogether. Keyframe previews, these are the parameters that this keyframe took a snapshot of. Just the ones that are showing, basically. Camera and the angle that we're looking at the camera. So now I have one keyframe. There's a couple things I can do with this. I can render this keyframe anytime by just double-clicking on it, and it'll render over here. I can also right-click on it and render this keyframe. But one keyframe by itself does nothing. I need to have another keyframe so that the computer will morph or interpolate the differences between the two. So let me go over here to my navigation pane, make sure that this step slider isn't all the way to the right, because then I'll make massive giant steps. I want to make it, let's call it at a third of the way over here. I'm going to tap forward once, and we moved forward. Move it just a little bit more. Couple taps, there we go. Now we have gone closer to it. The coordinates have all changed, and I'm going to take another keyframe. Now, there are insert and add keyframe. Whatever keyframe that my cursor is selected on, which in this case there's only one, but once I click on it, it'll select. If I hit insert keyframe, it'll add this keyframe in front of it. If I hit add keyframe, it'll add it behind it. So I'm going to add keyframe. Now, what if I wanted this keyframe and I hit the wrong one and I'm like, oh no, what do I do here? Well, I can double click here, put those parameters back in Mandelbulber, and then I select keyframe 1, and this time I add to keyframe, and I go back to the first keyframe and I delete it out. Let's see, right here, delete keyframe. So now I'm going from bigger to smaller instead of from smaller to bigger. But I actually want to go from smaller to bigger, so I'm going to double click to put the parameters back in Mandelbulber, put my cursor on that to select it, and this time go insert keyframe, go back to that keyframe and delete it out. Okay, we have now played with 2 keyframes, 1 and 2. Now let me go in even more. Let me maybe, I'll pull this window open a little bit more. Let me rotate a little bit. Rotate there. The top frame's going to move the camera, and the bottom frame, or the object rather, well, we won't get into advanced navigation at the moment. Simply say I have different parameters, different coordinates for the camera. Let me add this keyframe. Boop. I now have 3 keyframes, and let me morph just a little bit more. Change the viewpoint just a bit more. I'm going to add that keyframe, and then I want to take us all the way back to where we started from. And how do I do that? Well, the easiest way is just to double click that first keyframe to load the parameters back in the memory. Then let me click on my last frame over here, and I have a slider bar down here at the bottom. Let me select this last frame and go add keyframe. So you'll notice that keyframe 4 is the same as keyframe 1. And that's pretty cool. We could now render this out. Here in each keyframe, we'll take a look at it real quickly. We have the letter and number of the keyframe. But sometimes if we're deleting and adding keyframes, these numbers will get messed up. If we hit refresh table, that'll usually renumber our keyframes and also refresh the image. Okay, what do we want to do next? We want to actually render this thing. So let's go back over here, make sure we have image type selected as JPEG. Our choices are, we have PNGs, JPEGs, EXRs, and TIFFs. Short of PNGs, occasionally I will use, but more than likely, most times for making an intensive animation, I'm going to use a JPEG because the file sizes are just way too large. Then when I compress them down anyway, the whole point of having JPEG is lost. So first frame to render is going to be here 0. Last frame is set on the default 0. If I drag it all the way to the right, we now see it's at 400, and that's because I have 100 keyframes per, 100 frames per keyframe. So that's going to make 400 total by the time we get through these 4 keyframes. Now, I could do more than just change the camera. I could do something fancy. I could go over here to Object, and I see that the power of this particular Mandelbulb is a 9 by default. I want to play around with that. I want to change, I could slide this down and try to grab 4, that's where I want to go, but instead I'm just going to select, hit 4, and get there automatically. When I hit render over here, I could have auto refresh that would render automatically, but I prefer not to. You'll now see that it's a power of 4. What if I want just this keyframe number 1 here to morph to this shape? Well, I can select it. I can hit modify keyframe. Boom. And now it looks like this shape. But the problem is, this power that I changed over here, I didn't add this parameter to the parameters of the keyframe. So the keyframe took a snapshot of this fractal, but it didn't take the information about the power. So watch what happens when I render this one. I've changed the power to 4, but watch what happens when I do this first one or the second one. They're all like that. When I refresh the table, they all are power 4. Well, that's not what I want. I want just this one keyframe here to be 4 and the rest of them 9. So let me go back, change this to 9 again. Refresh my table, and it didn't work. Sometimes I have to double click, and then maybe double click on another one, then hit refresh. There we go. Now, if I want just this one frame here to be a power, I can go over to this power menu, and here, if I put my cursor in that value and I right click on it, you'll see right here at the bottom it says add to keyframe animation. Click that, and now we'll see, in addition to the camera parameters here, that I have the fractal power. I can now morph the fractal power from one keyframe to another. I could literally click on the keyframe right here, change that to a 4, hit enter, it'll automatically refresh there. See? And this one still is 9, this one still is 4, and so on. I could have also, let's change this one back to 9. I could also have done it manually by selecting the keyframe, going over here to my menu and manually selecting that onto 4, like such, and then modify keyframe, and that's going to change that to a 4. We could have done that by just clicking on it manually. So now we're going to modify both the main camera parameters and also this fractal power. So we've now set up a short little mini fractal that's going to repeat back to the original as we morph through some things. Let's take a look at what other things we have to do here. One thing we haven't looked at is validate. Now, as I'm moving the camera around through this fractal, I might end up banging into stuff. That happens quite a lot, actually, especially if I'm going deep inside of a fractal and I go from point A to point B, and I might hit point A, point B, A.5 along to B because there's something in the way. How do I check if there's something in the way short of rendering out the entire animation, which is what we used to have to do in version 1? This validate before render, if that's clicked on, every time I hit render, it'll validate, or it'll check to see if there's any collisions. How far away does it consider a collision? That's this collision distance that we left alone. I frankly never touch that. That's always set there by default, and I just leave it alone. But if I go over here to this button here, validate, click it, and it checked through all of my keyframes and said no collisions detected. Yay! So now we're ready to go. I have a path for images set. I have selected JPEGs as a type. We're going to render first to the last. I may just want to render a fraction of these frames. I may want to render all of them. I may want to render some of them with a different device and some of them with this device. I won't get into that right now. Set the same camera distance for all keyframes. Let me hit that. In this case, it wouldn't have mattered, but I often do that to prevent some herky-jerky motion along the way. Leave the default setting at 0.1 and don't mess with it. Okay, we are ready to render. I am going to hit this render animation button here, and when I render the animation, it's going to render 100 frames between each keyframe, stick them in this folder here as JPEGs, and render 0 to 400 frames. And I'm going to hit render button now and let that go to town. As you see here on the bottom of the screen, I don't want to move my mouse too much, it's going to tell me it's frame number 35 of 400, it's the keyframe 0. It'll tell me how much I've done of the total job, which is 16%. It'll tell me how much time has elapsed, how much time to go to the end. On the bottom, it tells me the information for each frame. Now, it's going by way too quickly to see it, but it'll actually tell me how long it's been for each frame and how long it will be to the end of the frame. For frames that are minutes long, that can be quite useful information. So we're now into keyframe 1, which we've you can see that our power is morphing all the way here over to 9 here. We're now at a solid 9 because we've hit keyframe 2. So we went from 9 power to 4 power to 9 power, and we also moved the camera around. You'll see that the shape's moving around on our screen. And hopefully I haven't done any too drastic flips around. We're rounding into keyframe 3 now. Boom, that's right where 3 was. And 4, let's take a look. Let's slide over, take a look at 4. 4 is going to take us right back to where we started from. So when we're done, we should expect to see, right at frame 400, should be pretty much the same as frame 0 was. Boom. There we go. We rendered in real time, 800 by 600, a quick little mini video. Now, how do we check this video? Well, that's where the show animation video, show animation button is going to come into play. We click that, and by default, it's going to show 30 frames per second. It's going to show frame 1 of 400. We have 2 buttons, simply a stop button and a play button, and then this slider. The slider will take us all the way along through various frames. If I just simply hit play, it'll play the animation. Look at that. Hey, we made an animation and it morphed. And we bobbed to the left and we zoomed around, we bobbed to the right, and we flip back. And you'll notice that it'll repeat. Since we put the last frame and the first frame the same, it will loop around in a nice little GIF fashion here. We have created our first test animation. Now let's say we wanted to do this at HD quality. Let me stop that. Boom. Stop that. Now, over here, you can't read all these labels, but under right here, image adjustments tab, we had this set at 800 by 600. I could redo this entire movie at a higher setting by simply just hitting that setting and hitting render. Now the problem is though that folder is full of animation, full of frames rendered at a smaller resolution. There's a couple things I can do. If we wanted to run again in HD quality, we could just simply hit this button, delete all images, which be very careful because obviously you don't want to hit that at the end of it, render, and delete out images that you don't want to delete. For example, if we hit render animation, it would have gone through the folder and detected that we had rendered all the frames and said it's been rendered completely. Do you want to purge? That'll delete it. We could delete all frames by doing that, which we're going to hit no, or we can also just hit the delete all images button. Instead, I'm going to select folder and back it up to demo, new folder, call it HD, and we're going to save it there. Then I'm going to run over here under image, and I'm going to hit HD, boom, hit render, boom, and then this will start rendering in HD quality all those frames, which actually that's pretty quick, isn't it? It's almost, yeah. All right, that is rendering in Mandelbulber with keyframes. Keyframe Animation. I'm Steve Sink, Pagan Productions. See you later. Check out my own Fractal video channel here at YouTube, and also see you on Facebook under Mandelbulber, not Mandelbulb 3D, where I'm an admin. Happy fractaling and Merry Christmas.